I've been fairly critical of double action pistols in one or two videos. This is why I wanted to explain that my critical view comes not from a superficial understanding or some sort of personal dislike based in irrational beliefs, but instead from a well-reasoned argument, in addition to the historical view of why double action pistols became so widespread a number of years ago. Since there is so much information that I want to mention, this won't just be a single video. I'm also going to go into significant detail about the pros and cons of the 1911 as a defensive handgun, as well as the things that contribute to the reliability and accuracy in 1911s, or rather detract from those things if they aren't built right. First though, I'm going to do a quick explanation of the different kinds of pistol and revolver actions because I know some people don't know this. Single-action pistols have their hammers cocked when you rack the slide. Almost all single actions have a very short and crisp trigger. Double-action/single-action pistols have a very heavy and long first trigger pull. This is because the first trigger pull both cocks the hammer and drops it. Only the first trigger pull is double action and heavy. The rest of the shots will have lighter trigger pulls and shorter ones, but they aren't nearly as crisp or as good as a pistol that is only single action. There are also double action only pistols, meaning every trigger pull is long and heavy. Compared to single action pistols, most striker fired guns have long trigger pulls and the triggers aren't quite as good. But more importantly, the striker guns have consistent trigger pulls for every shot just like single action does. For revolvers, many of the guns made today can be fired both in single and double action. Single action is where you cock the hammer with your thumb before pulling the trigger, and this results in a much shorter and lighter trigger pull. Some older designs still exist that can only be fired in single action, and honestly this is a holdover from the very first revolvers, which were only in single action. There is no real advantage to having a single action only revolver, and it is a significant disadvantage in terms of being able to fire the gun quickly. Firing a revolver in double action is simply pulling the trigger, which both cocks the hammer and drops it. This again is a long and heavy trigger pull. Finally, there are some revolvers that can only be fired in double action. The logic behind these guns is that a protruding hammer spur will get caught on clothing or something else and ruin your ability to draw quickly under stress in a life or death situation. The other part of this logic for them is that in a gunfight, you don't have all the time in the world to cock the hammer with your thumb, and you only really need to fire double action because it's faster. For revolvers, firing in double action does make a lot of sense. The argument today for double action pistols is primarily one of safety and secondarily one of the ability to restrike a cartridge that does not go off. Earlier, there was also the argument that it was better for a less skilled or novice shooter due to the fact that you could carry with a round in the chamber without needing a safety. I'm going to address the simplest argument first and say that the ability to restrike a cartridge that didn't go off the first time is not a necessary one. This is a chart made from the information from a -40° reliability test done in Alaska by Chuck Taylor. By looking at this chart, we can immediately tell that the Smith & Wesson Model 39 was not striking the primers hard enough, while other handguns like the Glock 17 had no problems at all with the same ammunition. The Model 39 also apparently reached the point where it just stopped working. It's very obvious that a handgun that has sufficient striking force on the first try is what is important, and a strong spring is the needed feature here, not restrike capability. A couple of side notes about this test. They tested lubricants as well and found that REM oil works very well. They also noticed that the Glock 17 was significantly cleaner than the other guns at the end of the 750 round test. The only logical explanation that I could offer for this is that the polygonal rifling in the Glock barrel must be what was causing this. I also had a discussion with a subscriber about handgun reliability in very cold weather. He lives in Alaska, so he frequently has very cold weather, obviously. Anyway, the point is that he had not had any problems with cold weather affecting the reliability of his handgun ammunition. He mentioned that he had a Glock specifically. The reason why this is the case is because a Glock has sufficient striking force to ensure primer reliability in extreme cold. And while all primers are affected to some degree by the cold, This loss of handgun primer sensitivity is only really noticeable in handguns that have insufficient striking force. After doing some more research, I found that the Smith & Wesson Model 39 hammer spring is supposed to be significantly stronger than the Glock's striker spring. If everything was working as it should, then the 39 should have done very well. I'm not exactly sure what eventually stopped it from working because the author didn't actually mention that specifically. He generally said that the failures to fire were the most common type of malfunction due to the cold's effect of weakening the springs. He also said that the ammunition gives lower velocity at such temperatures, and because of this, it's important to have a recoil spring that is not too heavy. A final tangent would be the fact that 1911s ensure good primer strikes in normal conditions, even when the heavy firing pin return springs are used and a light mainspring is used. For those of you who are not familiar, the mainspring or hammer spring is a spring that imparts force on the hammer to hit the cartridge. If you had a light or weakened hammer spring and a very heavy firing pin return spring, this would make the gun more likely to have problems in extreme conditions, but actually safer in the event that you happen to drop the gun. This is due to the 1911 design not having a firing pin safety device. 1911s are generally not drop safe, so if you accidentally drop one right on the muzzle from a good height onto a hard surface, that can give the firing pin enough momentum to detonate the cartridge. Titanium firing pins are used in 1911s because they are lighter than steel and therefore allow the handgun to be dropped from a higher distance without an accidental discharge happening. However, their lower mass can mean lower reliability with certain ammunition. If all else is equal, this is why I believe a steel firing pin is better, especially if you live somewhere that gets very cold, because that will affect primers. Titanium firing pins don't actually make that much sense from a safety perspective either, because what is really needed is a firing pin safety device. The Kimber Series 2 and Smith & Wesson 1911s both have firing pin safeties. The Colt Series 80 and the guns based off that design, like the Para Ordnance, the SIG 1911, and the Taurus, all have firing pin safeties to my knowledge. If you want to buy a particular model of 1911, I would double check to make sure that it does have a firing pin safety, and that's how you know with certainty that it can safely be carried with a round in the chamber and will not discharge if dropped. Arguably, the best way to prevent an accidental discharge from a dropped 1911 is to use a holster that securely holds it. If you're using a somewhat questionable holster just because you got it for free, I'd say that sooner or later that's going to be a problem for you. Going back to the main point about double action, some primers will not detonate with just a second strike. One of the Darwin Award videos that Brandon Herrera made involved a woman trying to fire a double action pistol. I can't remember which video it was, but she had a round in the chamber that was not going off, so after she kept pulling the trigger for a while, it did finally discharge. Multiple trigger pulls for a single bullet is not what you want in a gunfight, so if the round does not go off the first time, you'd be better off getting the bad cartridge out of the gun so you can use the one that actually works. I understand that a round may go off on the second try, but I have to ask, is it really worth betting your life on that working for you? Likewise, if the ability to make multiple primer strikes was an important feature for handguns to have, if ammunition was not particularly reliable, or if the ammunition was exposed to the elements, then logically most or all military handguns would have this feature. The answer to primer insensitivity from a military's perspective is also to use more striking force, which is why the Colt 1902 Philippines model had such a powerful mainspring. Now for the safety argument. Of 674 officers observed by Lieutenant Dave Spaulding, 632 of them unknowingly and periodically put their finger inside of the trigger guard during FATS training. Many of these officers were highly skilled and trained. Dave Spaulding believes that these officers were subconsciously confirming the position of the trigger under stress with this action. This fact should be the strongest argument for a heavier double-action trigger, as having a double-action trigger that requires a very deliberate press should be safer, right? However, the fact that 42 of these officers did not make this mistake means that this problem is not universal. Since this is not a subconscious problem inherent to everyone, we could also say that identifying that this is a problem is the first step to identifying a solution. Similarly, we know that under stress, people can forget to take the manual safety off of their gun before they fire, and we also know that we can solve this problem by having someone practice that multiple times. So for the problem of unknowingly putting your finger inside of the trigger guard, we really want to have a human solution to the problem and not a mechanical one, because it is unacceptable to allow people to violate the rules of safety unknowingly under stress, regardless of the trigger weight of the weapon. If the brain wants to confirm the position of the trigger at a subconscious level, then repeated dry firing and using the same gun and same grip technique could very likely be a solution. Chris Baker from Lucky Gunner has stated that double-action guns, especially those with external hammers, are superior for inside the waistband appendix carry. His reasoning being that appendix carry is dangerous due to the gun's proximity to the femoral artery, and that a heavy double-action trigger gives more safety. He also talks about with his double-action pistol, he can hold down the hammer with his thumb while reholstering for greater safety. I don't want to get too far into the weeds with this discussion, but we have to ask the question, is appendix carry a good idea to begin with? I also believe appendix carry is inherently dangerous, which is why I would not carry a gun in that way. I believe that a good carry method should not require you to carry a double-action gun in order for you to feel safe, and it shouldn't certainly require you to compromise your safety by pointing the muzzle at body parts. I think it's appropriate now to go over the main two things that contribute to the general safety of the weapon other than the trigger weight and a competent user. Those things are obviously the holster and the trigger guard. If you have a gun with a very light trigger in your pocket with other items, you can probably tell that this is a dangerous thing to do because one of those items could get inside the trigger guard and accidentally pull the trigger. This is why people will put their pistol in a holster before they put it in a bag or purse as well. I could be wrong, but I believe the first double-action pistol was the Little Tom. It was a pocket pistol with a double-action only trigger. The most popular early double-action pistols were also the Walther PP series, which again are pocket pistols and are not large enough that most people would carry them in holsters. My point is that double action, when treated as a safety feature, would most apply to pocket pistols and not a pistol that you're carrying in a holster. At one point, it was popular to cut off the trigger guard of some revolvers, the idea being that it was faster to get your finger on the trigger if you don't have to deal with the trigger guard in any way. Obviously, the question of safety was raised with such a drastic and frankly really questionable modification. Captain Malphurs was a top combat pistol shooter and policeman at the time. He carried one of these revolvers with a cutaway trigger guard, and he was asked about the safety of such a thing. His logic being that such revolvers had heavy double-action triggers that were not likely to be accidentally pulled. He also believed that a policeman who knows enough about guns to do such a thing to his revolver would treat it with care and respect, so practically speaking, it was not a problem for him. Likewise, it was popular to cut away much of the metal on the trigger guard to accomplish the same goal, and this was called relieving. So a double-action trigger is enough to make a difference in safety in certain situations. A needlessly dangerous situation like a cutaway trigger guard, or like a gun in a pocket with other objects. So to me, the argument for a double-action trigger on a pistol doesn't really hold up because you can carry a gun in a holster. Likewise, if somebody butchered the trigger guard on a handgun, the first thing I would do is try to find a gunsmith who could see if he can fix it. I can confidently say that a cutaway gun is needlessly dangerous because shooting sports competitors don't do that these days, and some very fast cowboy action gunslingers have intact trigger guards as well, so I'm inclined to believe that a cut-down trigger guard was a mechanical solution to a lack of practice and skill on the part of the average person during that era. This trend is also an example of how people can be persuaded to do foolish things if a person in authority starts a fad. There is a recurring problem of human nature where prominent people are treated as experts, and are treated as if their word is the gospel truth, even though everyone can be wrong sometimes.